The marble halls of the Supreme Court had witnessed countless moments of legal brilliance, heated debate, and constitutional gravity. But nothing in its storied history could have prepared anyone for what was about to unfold on that crisp October morning. What started as routine oral arguments would transform into a moment so unexpected, so electrifying, that seasoned court reporters would later describe it as the day the highest court in the land fell completely silent. Not from reverence, but from shock. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In a chamber where every word is measured, every gesture scrutinized, and every exchange carries the weight of precedent, one woman's response to dismissive laughter would redefine what courage looks like in the face of institutional power. This wasn't just another legal proceeding. This was the moment when preparation met opportunity, when principle collided with politics, and when a single exchange would echo far beyond the confines of one First Street. What could possibly make the Chief Justice of the United States laugh openly during oral arguments? And how did that moment of apparent triumph transform into something he would never forget? The answer lies not in the laughter itself, but in what came after, a response so devastating in its clarity, so unexpected in its depth, that it would leave the most powerful judicial figure in America completely speechless. The morning air inside the Supreme Court building carried the weight of anticipation that only comes with cases of extraordinary magnitude. The marble corridors, polished to an almost mirror-like sheen, reflected the hurried footsteps of law clerks, journalists, and legal scholars who had gathered for what many considered the most significant constitutional challenge of the decade. The case of Morrison versus Federal Bureau of Investigation had drawn national attention, not just for its legal implications, but for the woman who would be arguing before the 9 justices. Pam Bondi stood in the attorney preparation room, her navy blue suit impeccable, her briefcase containing not just legal documents, but the culmination of months of meticulous research and preparation. Unlike the typical Supreme Court advocate, she wasn't a seasoned appellate lawyer who had argued dozens of cases before the High Court. She was a former state attorney general who had voluntarily taken on this case pro bono, representing a group of FBI whistleblowers whose careers had been destroyed for exposing internal corruption. The case had already generated controversy before it reached the Supreme Court. Lower courts had dismissed the whistleblowers' claims, citing national security concerns and the broad discretionary powers of federal agencies. Legal experts had predicted the Supreme Court would decline to hear the case entirely. But something about the petition had caught the attention of at least 4 justices, and now here they were, preparing to argue whether federal employees have constitutional protection when exposing criminal conduct within their own agencies. Dr. Margaret Chen, the lead whistleblower and a forensic analyst who had worked for the FBI's cybercrime division for 12 years, sat quietly in the gallery. Her hands were folded in her lap, but those who knew her could see the slight tremor that she couldn't quite suppress. She had lost her career, her pension, and nearly her home for refusing to alter evidence in a case that implicated senior FBI officials in unauthorized surveillance of American citizens. The 3 other whistleblowers who had joined the case sat nearby, their faces etched with the same combination of hope and exhaustion that comes from years of legal battles. The government's legal team, led by Solicitor General David Morrison, occupied the opposite side of the attorney preparation area. Morrison was a Supreme Court veteran with over 30 successful arguments under his belt. His team of Department of Justice lawyers had prepared extensively, confident that national security precedents and the court's traditional deference to executive branch agencies would carry the day. They had reviewed Bondi's legal background thoroughly and concluded that while she was competent, she lacked the specialized expertise needed for Supreme Court advocacy. What they hadn't anticipated was the depth of Bondi's preparation, or her unconventional approach to constitutional law. While Morrison's team had focused on precedent and procedural arguments, Bondi had spent months diving into the historical foundations of whistleblower protections, tracing them back to the founding era and connecting them to fundamental principles of democratic accountability. She had studied not just Supreme Court cases, but the personal writings of the framers, the debates at the Constitutional Convention, and early American legal traditions that predated formal whistleblower statutes. In the gallery, members of the press occupied their designated section, notebooks ready and cameras positioned for the moment when the proceedings would begin. Among them sat veteran Supreme Court correspondent Lisa Martinez, who had covered the court for 15 years and had seen every type of advocate imaginable. She watched Bondi through the glass partition and noted something unusual about her demeanor. Unlike most first-time Supreme Court advocates who typically displayed visible nervousness or intense focus on their notes, Bondi appeared remarkably calm, almost serene. The courtroom itself was beginning to fill with the usual mix of legal academics, government officials, and members of the public who had won the lottery for seats to observe oral arguments. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, but also with skepticism. Legal commentators had already written extensively about the case, with most predicting a swift dismissal of the whistleblower's claims. The conventional wisdom held that the Supreme Court would be reluctant to create new restrictions on federal agency authority, particularly in matters touching on national security. Behind the bench, in the private conference room, where the 9 justices gathered before each session, Chief Justice John Roberts was reviewing his notes one final time. Known for his sharp questioning and occasional moments of dry humor during oral arguments, Roberts had already formed preliminary opinions about the case based on the written briefs. The government's position seemed legally sound, grounded in well-established precedent about executive branch authority and the special considerations that apply to national security matters. Justice Roberts had read Bondi's brief with interest, but had noted what he considered several weaknesses in her legal reasoning. Her arguments relied heavily on historical analysis and constitutional principles that, while intellectually interesting, seemed to lack the specific legal foundation needed to overcome decades of contrary precedent. He had prepared several pointed questions designed to expose these weaknesses and guide the court toward what he saw as the correct legal conclusion. What the Chief Justice didn't realize was that Bondi had anticipated exactly this type of challenge. She had spent weeks studying not just his judicial opinions, but his questioning patterns, his legal philosophy, and his approach to constitutional interpretation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She knew that he would likely attempt to corner her with questions about precedent and practical implications. She was ready. The other justices were similarly prepared, but with varying levels of engagement. Justice Elena Kagan had shown particular interest in the case during their private conference, raising questions about the balance between national security and individual rights. Justice Samuel Alito had expressed concerns about the potential impact on law enforcement operations. Justice Sonia Sotomayor had questioned whether existing legal remedies were adequate to protect whistleblowers in federal agencies. As the morning progressed, small details began to accumulate that would later seem significant. The court's audio technician noticed that the sound system was performing exceptionally well, ensuring that every word would be captured with perfect clarity. The stenographer, a 20-year veteran of Supreme Court proceedings, had arrived early to ensure her equipment was functioning flawlessly. Even the lighting seemed particularly bright, as if the chamber itself was preparing for something extraordinary. Dr. Chen glanced at her watch and saw that they were approaching the moment when the justices would take the bench. She thought about the journey that had brought her to this point, from her early days as an idealistic young analyst who believed that truth and justice were the same thing, to the bitter realization that institutions she had trusted could become instruments of the very corruption they were supposed to prevent. The cost of her decision to speak out had been enormous, but sitting in the Supreme Court, she felt for the first time in years that the sacrifice might have meaning. Bondi closed her briefcase and stood, smoothing her jacket with the unconscious gesture of someone preparing for battle. She had reviewed her opening statement dozens of times, but she knew that oral arguments rarely proceeded according to plan. The justices would interrupt with questions, challenge her assumptions, and attempt to probe the weaknesses in her position. She was prepared for all of that. What she wasn't prepared for was the particular form that the challenge would take. The deputy clerk of the court appeared at the attorney preparation room door, signaling that it was time for the advocates to take their positions at the counsel tables. Bondi gathered her materials, took a deep breath, and walked toward what would become one of the most memorable moments in Supreme Court history. Behind her, Dr. Chen and the other whistleblowers followed, their footsteps echoing softly in the marble hallway. The courtroom was now completely full, every seat occupied by observers who sensed they were about to witness something significant. The press section was packed with reporters from major news organizations, their attention focused not just on the legal issues at stake, but on the human drama of the whistleblowers' fight for vindication. Legal scholars who had written extensively about the case sat in the academic section, notebooks ready to record every exchange. At precisely 10 o'clock, the marshal of the court called for order, and the 9 justices emerged from behind the burgundy curtains to take their seats. Chief Justice Roberts, seated at the center of the bench, surveyed the courtroom with the practiced eye of someone who had presided over thousands of such proceedings. His gaze lingered for a moment on Bondi, noting her composed demeanor and wondering if she truly understood the magnitude of the legal challenge she was about to face. The Chief Justice opened the session with the traditional formalities, acknowledging the attorneys and outlining the case to be argued. His voice carried the authority of his office, but also a hint of the skepticism that had colored his review of the legal briefs. He had seen countless attorneys attempt to argue cases beyond their expertise, and he expected this morning to follow a familiar pattern of well-intentioned but ultimately unsuccessful advocacy. Solicitor General Morrison would argue first, defending the government's position that federal agencies must have broad discretionary authority to manage their internal affairs, particularly in matters involving national security. His argument would be polished, professional, and grounded in established legal precedent. The justices would ask pointed but respectful questions, and Morrison would provide competent answers that reinforced the strength of the government's position. Then Bondi would have her 30 minutes to argue for the whistleblowers, and Chief Justice Roberts expected that portion of the proceeding to be more challenging. Not because he wanted to be difficult, but because he genuinely believed that her legal position was flawed and that rigorous questioning would expose those flaws. He had prepared questions designed to guide her toward acknowledging the weaknesses in her case, questions that would help the court reach what he saw as the correct legal conclusion. The morning sun streamed through the courtroom's tall windows, casting long shadows across the mahogany counsel tables where the 2 legal teams sat facing the bench. In a few minutes, Morrison would stand to begin his argument, and the formal proceedings would commence. But the real drama would begin when Bondi rose to address the court, when her months of preparation would meet the collective legal expertise. of the 9 justices, and when a moment of unexpected laughter would set in motion events that no one in that room could have anticipated. The atmosphere in the courtroom was electric with possibility, charged with the knowledge that constitutional history was about to be made. Every person present, from the justices on the bench to the observers in the gallery, understood that they were witnessing something significant. What none of them realized was that they were about to see something unprecedented, a moment when careful preparation, principled conviction, and unexpected opportunity would combine to create an exchange that would be remembered long after the legal precedent was established. Chief Justice Roberts glanced at the clock and prepared to call the first case. In the gallery, Dr. Chen closed her eyes briefly and said a silent prayer for the woman who had agreed to carry their cause to the highest court in the land. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the drama was about to begin. Solicitor General David Morrison rose from his seat with the fluid confidence of a man who had stood before this bench dozens of times before. His charcoal grey suit was perfectly tailored, his posture erect but not rigid, and his expression carried the quiet assurance of someone who believed deeply in both his legal position and his ability to articulate it persuasively. The morning light caught the edges of his wire-rimmed glasses as he approached the podium, and for a moment the courtroom held that particular kind of silence that precedes significant legal argument. Morrison placed his hands on either side of the lectern and looked up at the 9 justices with the respectful attention that Supreme Court protocol demanded. He'd spent the previous evening in final preparation, reviewing not just his own argument, but studying the questioning patterns and judicial philosophies of each justice. He knew exactly how he wanted to frame the government's position, and he was confident that precedent and practical necessity would carry the day. Chief Justice Roberts nodded slightly, signaling that Morrison could begin, and the Solicitor General launched into an opening that had been refined through weeks of practice sessions with Department of Justice colleagues. His voice was clear and measured, carrying the weight of federal authority without sounding imperious. He began by acknowledging the serious nature of the whistleblower's allegations, while simultaneously establishing why those allegations, however sincere, could not overcome the fundamental legal principles at stake. The government's position was built on several interconnected arguments that Morrison presented with methodical precision. Federal agencies, he argued, must have the discretionary authority to manage their internal operations, particularly when national security considerations were involved. The FBI's authority to protect sensitive information and ongoing investigations was not merely a matter of administrative convenience, but a constitutional necessity grounded in the executive branch's responsibility for law enforcement and national defense. Morrison moved through his argument with the practiced rhythm of an experienced advocate, pausing at key moments to allow his points to register with the justices, modulating his voice to emphasize the most crucial elements of his case. He cited a string of precedents that supported broad executive authority in matters of national security, from the landmark case of United States versus Reynolds through more recent decisions that had consistently deferred to agency expertise in protecting classified information and ongoing investigations. Justice Clarence Thomas was the first to interrupt with a question, his voice characteristically measured and deliberate. He wanted to understand the precise scope of the discretionary authority that Morrison was claiming for federal agencies. Did the government's position mean that agencies could terminate employees for any reason they deemed related to national security, even if that reason was pretextual? Morrison responded with careful precision, acknowledging that agency authority was not unlimited, while maintaining that courts should be extremely reluctant to second-guess genuine national security determinations. Justice Stephen Breyer followed with a more practical line of inquiry, asking about the potential consequences if the court were to accept the whistleblower's position. Would federal agencies become unable to maintain necessary confidentiality? Would ongoing investigations be compromised by employees who disagreed with agency priorities? Morrison seized on these questions to paint a picture of the chaos that could result from judicial interference with executive branch operations. The exchange continued for several minutes, with Morrison fielding questions from across the ideological spectrum of the court. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg pressed him on whether existing legal protections for whistleblowers were adequate, while Justice Neil Gorsuch questioned whether the government's position might create perverse incentives for agencies to retaliate against employees who expose genuine wrongdoing. Morrison handled each question with professional competence, neither conceding too much ground nor appearing evasive. As his 30 minutes drew to a close, Morrison felt confident that he had successfully presented the government's case. The key justices had asked challenging questions, but none had seemed to shake the fundamental strength of his position. He had grounded his argument in well-established precedent, practical necessity, and constitutional principles that the court had consistently upheld. When Chief Justice Roberts indicated that his time was nearly expired, Morrison offered a brief but forceful conclusion that summarized the core of his argument. The Solicitor General returned to his seat with the satisfaction of someone who had executed his game plan effectively. He had anticipated most of the justices' questions and had provided solid answers that reinforced the strength of the government's position. His colleagues at the council table nodded their approval, and he felt the quiet confidence that comes from a job well done. Now it would be Pam Bondi's turn to argue for the whistleblowers, and Morrison was curious to see how she would handle the same searching questions that he had just navigated. The courtroom stirred slightly as attention shifted to the other council table, where Bondi was making her final preparations to address the court. She had listened intently to Morrison's argument, taking occasional notes but showing no visible reaction to either his points or the justices' questions. Her demeanor remained remarkably calm, almost meditative, in a way that struck several observers as unusual for a first-time Supreme Court advocate. Chief Justice Roberts announced that the court would now hear from counsel for the petitioners, and Bondi rose from her seat with a deliberate grace that immediately drew attention. Unlike Morrison's practiced confidence, her approach to the podium carried a different energy entirely, something that several of the justices noticed without being able to immediately identify. She placed her materials on the lectern with precise care and looked up at the bench with an expression that was respectful but unintimidated. When she began to speak, her voice carried a clarity that filled the courtroom without seeming forced or amplified. She thanked the Chief Justice and the court for the opportunity to present her case, and then launched into an opening that immediately distinguished itself from Morrison's more conventional approach. Rather than beginning with legal precedent or constitutional doctrine, she started with a simple but powerful statement about the nature of constitutional government in a democratic society. The Constitution, she argued, was not merely a framework for governmental power, but a covenant between the American people and their government. A covenant that promised that power would be exercised with transparency, accountability, and respect for individual rights. When government agencies operated in secrecy and punished those who sought to expose wrongdoing, they violated not just specific legal protections, but the fundamental promise of democratic governance itself. Justice Samuel Alito interrupted almost immediately, clearly skeptical of what he saw as an overly broad constitutional claim. He wanted to know how Bondi's interpretation of constitutional principles could be squared with the well-established doctrine of executive privilege and the legitimate need for governmental secrecy in matters of national security. His question was pointed and somewhat aggressive, designed to force her to acknowledge the weaknesses in her position. Bondi's response surprised him. Rather than retreating into defensive legalese or attempting to minimize the force of his challenge, she met it head-on with a detailed discussion of the historical foundations of executive privilege and its proper scope under constitutional law. She demonstrated an understanding of the doctrine's development that was both sophisticated and nuanced, acknowledging its legitimate applications while arguing that it had been stretched far beyond its constitutional boundaries in cases like the one before the court. Justice Sonia Sotomayor followed with a question about the practical implications of the relief that Bondi was seeking. If the court were to rule in favor of the whistleblowers, what would prevent every disgruntled federal employee from claiming constitutional protection for disclosing sensitive information? Bondi responded with a carefully crafted answer that distinguished between genuine whistleblowing and mere disagreement with agency policies, grounding her distinction in both legal, precedent, and constitutional principle. The questioning continued, with each justice probing different aspects of Bondi's argument. Justice Elena Kagan asked about the relationship between her constitutional claims and existing statutory protections for whistleblowers. Justice Brett Kavanaugh wanted to understand how her interpretation of the First Amendment might affect other areas of federal employment law. Justice Amy Coney Barrett questioned whether the relief she was seeking might interfere with legitimate law enforcement operations. With each question, Bondi demonstrated a depth of preparation and understanding that began to shift the atmosphere in the courtroom. Unlike many advocates who struggled to maintain their composure under aggressive questioning, she seemed to welcome each challenge as an opportunity to further develop her argument. Her answers were not defensive, but constructive, building upon the justice's questions to create a more complete picture of her legal position. About 15 minutes into her argument, Justice Thomas asked a question that would prove to be pivotal. He wanted to know whether Bondi believed that the Constitution required federal agencies to tolerate employees who repeatedly disclosed sensitive information, even if that disclosure damaged ongoing investigations or compromised national security operations. It was a fair question, but one that seemed designed to force her into an untenable position. Bondi paused for a moment before responding, and in that pause, several observers noted a subtle change in her demeanor. Her voice, when she resumed speaking, carried a different quality, something that combined intellectual precision with moral conviction in a way that drew the complete attention of everyone in the courtroom. She began by acknowledging the seriousness of Justice Thomas's concern, but then proceeded to reframe the question in a way that revealed its underlying assumptions. The real issue, she argued, was not whether the Constitution required agencies to tolerate the disclosure of legitimately sensitive information, but whether it permitted agencies to retaliate against employees who exposed criminal conduct under the guise of protecting national security. The whistleblowers in this case had not disclosed sensitive operational details or compromised ongoing investigations. They had exposed illegal surveillance activities that violated the constitutional rights of American citizens. She then did something that no one in the courtroom expected. Rather than simply citing legal precedent or constitutional text, she began to tell the story of Dr. Margaret Chen and the other whistleblowers in deeply personal terms. She described Dr. Chen's 12-year career with the FBI, her exemplary record of service, and her gradual realization that supervisors were pressuring her to alter forensic evidence to support surveillance operations that had no legal authorization. The courtroom was completely silent as Bondi painted a picture of federal employees who had discovered that their own agency was engaged in systematic constitutional violations and had faced an impossible choice between their oath to uphold the Constitution and their loyalty to their employer. These were not disgruntled employees seeking to embarrass the government, she argued, but dedicated public servants who had risked everything to protect the constitutional rights of their fellow citizens. Justice Alito attempted to interrupt with another skeptical question, but something in Bondi's tone and the power of her narrative made him hesitate. She continued her story, describing how Dr. Chen had initially tried to work within the system, reporting her concerns to supervisors and following established procedures for addressing ethical violations. When those internal channels failed, she had sought legal counsel and attempted to find ways to address the constitutional violations without compromising legitimate law enforcement operations. Only when it became clear that the violations were not aberrational but systematic and that no internal remedy was available, did Dr. Chen and her colleagues make the difficult decision to disclose the illegal activities to congressional oversight, committees, and ultimately to the press. Even then, they had taken extraordinary care to protect sensitive information and operational details, focusing their disclosures on the constitutional violations while avoiding any disclosure that might compromise legitimate investigations or endanger personnel. The response from FBI leadership, Bondi continued, had been swift and punitive. Rather than investigating the constitutional violations that had been exposed, the agency had launched a comprehensive effort to identify and punish the whistleblowers. Dr. Chen and her colleagues had been subjected to internal investigations, stripped of their security clearances, reassigned to meaningless positions, and ultimately forced out of government service entirely. As Bondi developed this narrative, something remarkable began to happen in the courtroom. The justices, who had begun the session with polite but skeptical attention, were becoming genuinely engaged with her argument. Even those who were ideologically predisposed to support broad executive authority were clearly moved by the human story she was telling and troubled by the implications of the government's conduct. Justice Ginsburg asked a question that revealed her own growing concern about the case. She wanted to understand how federal employees could be expected to uphold their constitutional oath if they faced retaliation for exposing constitutional violations within their own agencies. The question opened the door for Bondi to develop one of the most powerful aspects of her argument: the idea that constitutional government required not just formal legal protections, but a culture of accountability that encouraged, rather than punished, those who sought to uphold constitutional principles. Chief Justice Roberts had been following the argument with increasing interest, but he remained skeptical of what he saw as Bondi's expansive interpretation of constitutional protections. For federal employees, he had prepared several pointed questions designed to expose the weaknesses in her legal position. And as her 30 minutes began to wind down, he decided to press what he saw as the fundamental flaw in her argument. The Chief Justice leaned forward slightly and fixed Bondi with the kind of direct gaze that had intimidated countless attorneys over the years. His question, when it came, was delivered with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, designed to cut through what he saw as the emotional appeal of her narrative to expose the legal inadequacy of her constitutional claims. He wanted to know how she could reconcile her broad interpretation of First Amendment protections with the well-established principle that government employees enjoyed only limited constitutional protections in their employment relationships. The question was not merely technical, but philosophical, challenging the fundamental premises of her argument in a way that would require her to either concede significant ground or defend a constitutional interpretation that seemed to conflict with decades of established precedent. The courtroom fell silent as everyone waited for her response, recognizing that this was likely to be the crucial moment of the entire proceeding. Bondi looked at the Chief Justice for a long moment, and those who were watching closely could see that she was not merely formulating a legal answer, but considering something deeper about the nature of constitutional government and the relationship between individual conscience and institutional authority. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a quiet confidence that suggested she had been preparing for exactly this moment throughout her entire legal career. She began by acknowledging the force of the Chief Justice's question and the legitimate concerns that underlay it about the proper balance between governmental authority and individual rights. But then she proceeded to challenge the premise of the question itself, arguing that the established precedent he was citing had been developed in cases involving ordinary employment disputes, rather than situations where federal employees were being punished for exposing constitutional violations by their own agencies. The distinction, she argued, was not merely technical, but fundamental to the proper functioning of constitutional government. If federal agencies could claim unlimited authority to punish employees who exposed constitutional violations, then the Constitution's system of checks and balances would be fatally compromised. The executive branch would become, in effect, a law unto itself, accountable to no external authority and capable of suppressing any internal dissent that might expose its constitutional failures. Chief Justice Roberts interrupted with a follow-up question that was even sharper than his initial inquiry. He pointed out that Bondi's interpretation would seem to give every federal employee the right to second-guess agency policies and disclose sensitive information whenever they personally believed that constitutional violations were occurring. Such a rule, he suggested with a slight smile that seemed to indicate his confidence in the strength of his challenge, would make effective government virtually impossible. It was at that moment that something unexpected happened. The Chief Justice's smile, intended to underscore the weakness of Bondi's position, seemed to trigger something in her that transformed the entire dynamic of the exchange. Rather than appearing defensive or intimidated by his challenge, she straightened slightly and looked at him with an expression that combined respect for his office with absolute confidence in her position. Her response began quietly, almost conversationally, but with an underlying strength that immediately commanded attention. She told the Chief Justice that she understood his concern about the practical implications of her argument, but that she wanted to pose a question in return. In a constitutional system based on the rule of law, she asked, who ultimately bears the responsibility for ensuring that government agencies comply with constitutional limitations on their authority? The question hung in the air for a moment, and Chief Justice Roberts's smile began to fade as he realized that she was not merely responding to his challenge, but turning it back on him in a way that exposed its underlying assumptions. Bondi continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, arguing that the Constitution's system of separated powers and checks and balances was meaningless if the executive branch could simply suppress any internal evidence of constitutional violations. The framers of the Constitution, she argued, had understood that power would always seek to expand beyond its proper boundaries, and that formal legal constraints would be ineffective unless there were real consequences for violating them. If federal agencies could retaliate against employees who exposed constitutional violations without facing any judicial scrutiny, then the Constitution's protections would become mere words on paper, honored in theory, but ignored in practice. She then did something that no one in the courtroom expected. Rather than continuing with abstract constitutional argument, she began to recite specific details about the surveillance program that Dr. Chen and her colleagues had exposed. Details that had not appeared in any of the legal briefs, and that demonstrated a level of factual knowledge that went far beyond typical appellate advocacy. The program, she revealed, had involved the systematic collection of electronic communications from American citizens without judicial authorization, in direct violation of the Fourth Amendment's warrant requirement. When Dr. Chen and her colleagues had discovered the program and attempted to report it through internal channels. They had been told that the activities were authorized by secret legal opinions that they were not permitted to review. The surveillance had not been limited to suspected criminals or national security threats, but had included journalists, political activists, and ordinary citizens whose only crime was expressing views that agency officials found objectionable. When Dr. Chen had attempted to document the scope of the constitutional violations, she had been ordered to destroy evidence and falsify forensic reports to conceal the program's existence. As Bondi revealed these details, the atmosphere in the courtroom became electric with tension. Several of the justices leaned forward in their chairs, clearly surprised by the scope and seriousness of the allegations. Chief Justice Roberts' expression had changed completely. The confident smile replaced by a look of deep concern and growing realization that the case before the court involved far more serious constitutional issues than he had initially understood. Justice Kagan asked a series of rapid-fire questions about the surveillance program and the evidence that supported Bondi's allegations. Justice Sotomayor wanted to know why these details had not been included in the original legal briefs. Justice Gorsuch questioned whether the government's attorneys were aware of the specific constitutional violations that Bondi was describing. Bondi's responses revealed that she had spent months conducting her own investigation into the surveillance program, interviewing former FBI employees, reviewing declassified documents, and piecing together a comprehensive picture of constitutional violations that went far beyond what had been publicly disclosed. The government's legal briefs, she suggested, had systematically minimized the scope and seriousness of the violations in order to frame the case as a routine employment dispute rather than a fundamental constitutional crisis. The revelation transformed the entire proceeding. What had begun as a somewhat technical legal argument about the scope of employee protections had become an exposé of systematic constitutional violations within one of the federal government's most powerful agencies. The justices were no longer simply evaluating competing legal interpretations, but confronting evidence of serious misconduct that went to the heart of constitutional government. Chief Justice Roberts attempted to regain control of the proceeding by asking Bondi to focus on the specific legal issues before the court rather than the underlying factual allegations. But his request came across as defensive rather than authoritative, and Bondi responded by arguing that the legal and factual issues were inseparable. The constitutional protections she was advocating were meaningless unless they applied to exactly the kind of situation that Dr. Chen and her colleagues had faced. As her 30 minutes drew to a close, Bondi prepared to conclude her argument with a final appeal that would synthesize the legal and moral dimensions of her case. She had successfully shifted the focus of the proceeding from abstract legal doctrine to concrete constitutional violations, and she could see that several of the justices were genuinely troubled by what they had learned. But she also knew that legal arguments alone would not be sufficient to overcome the institutional biases that favored governmental authority over individual rights. The stage was set for a conclusion that would either solidify her advantage or allow the government to regain control of the narrative. Everything she had worked for over the past months of preparation would come down to how effectively she could synthesize the complex legal and factual issues into a coherent vision of constitutional government that would resonate with a majority of the justices. The silence that followed Bondi's revelations was unlike anything the Supreme Court had experienced in decades. It wasn't the ordinary quiet of judicial contemplation or the respectful pause that typically preceded closing arguments. This was the heavy, charged silence of a courtroom grappling with the sudden realization that everything they thought they knew about the case had fundamentally changed. The 9 justices sat motionless behind their mahogany bench, each processing the implications of what they had just heard in their own way. Chief Justice Roberts found himself in an unprecedented position. Throughout his tenure on the court, he had prided himself on his ability to maintain control over oral arguments, to guide discussions toward productive legal analysis, and to ensure that proceedings remained focused on constitutional principles, rather than political controversies. But Bondi's systematic dismantling of the government's narrative had left him momentarily speechless, struggling to find a path forward that would preserve both the dignity of the court and the integrity of the legal process. The Chief Justice's initial confidence in the strength of the government's position had evaporated entirely. What he had viewed as a routine case involving the proper scope of employee protections had revealed itself to be something far more serious and complex. The evidence that Bondi had presented suggested not merely isolated incidents of misconduct, but a systematic pattern of constitutional violations that struck at the very heart of democratic governance. Justice Clarence Thomas was the first to break the silence, his characteristically measured voice carrying an unusual note of urgency. He wanted to understand the timeline of the surveillance program that Bondi had described and the specific legal authorities that the FBI had claimed justified their activities. His questions revealed a deep concern about the separation of powers implications of allowing executive agencies to operate under secret legal interpretations that were immune from judicial review. Bondi responded with the precision of someone who had anticipated exactly these questions. She explained that the surveillance program had been operational for over 3 years before Dr. Chen and her colleagues had discovered its existence. During that time, it had collected electronic communications from tens of thousands of American citizens, including members of Congress, federal judges, and journalists who covered national security issues. The legal justifications for the program, she continued, had been contained in a series of classified legal opinions issued by the Office of Legal Counsel within the Department of Justice. These opinions had interpreted existing surveillance statutes in ways that effectively nullified the Fourth Amendment's warrant requirement, creating a secret body of constitutional law that bore no resemblance to the public understanding of constitutional protections. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg leaned forward with visible concern, asking how such a program could have operated for years without any external oversight or judicial review. Bondi's answer revealed the sophisticated mechanisms that had been developed to conceal the program's existence from both Congress and the federal courts. Surveillance data had been laundered through parallel construction techniques that concealed its true source, while briefings to congressional oversight committees had systematically omitted any reference to the program's scope or constitutional implications. Justice Stephen Breyer interrupted with a practical question about remedies. Even if the court were to accept Bondi's constitutional arguments, what relief could realistically be provided to the whistleblowers who had been retaliated against for exposing the program? The damage to their careers had already been done, and the surveillance program itself had been discontinued following congressional pressure generated by their disclosures. Bondi's response revealed the broader vision that had motivated her decision to take the case. The immediate relief sought for Dr. Chen and her colleagues was important, she argued, but the real stakes involved the future of constitutional government in America. If federal agencies could retaliate against employees who exposed constitutional violations without facing any legal consequences, then the Constitution's system of checks and balances would become meaningless. The case was ultimately about establishing a principle that would protect future whistleblowers and ensure that constitutional violations could not be concealed indefinitely through institutional secrecy and retaliation. The court had an opportunity to send a clear message that constitutional government required transparency, accountability, and respect for the rule of law, even when those principles conflicted with institutional convenience or political expedience. Justice Samuel Alito, who had been notably silent during this portion of the argument, finally spoke with a question that cut to the heart of his concerns about the case. He wanted to know whether Bondi's constitutional interpretation would effectively transform every federal employee into a roving constitutional monitor, empowered to disclose sensitive information whenever they personally disagreed with agency policies or legal interpretations. The question was pointed and skeptical, designed to highlight what Alito saw as the dangerous implications of accepting Bondi's arguments. But rather than retreating from the challenge, Bondi embraced it as an opportunity to clarify the careful distinctions that underpinned her constitutional theory. She began by acknowledging that Justice Alito's concern reflected a legitimate worry about the proper balance between governmental authority and individual rights. But the constitutional protections she was advocating were not unlimited or subjective. They applied only in cases where federal employees had evidence of clear constitutional violations, had attempted to address those violations through internal channels, and had taken care to minimize any disclosure of legitimately sensitive information. The standard she was proposing, Bondi continued, was both objective and demanding. It would not protect employees who disagreed with policy choices or who disclosed information merely because they found it politically objectionable. Instead, it would create a narrow but essential protection for those rare cases where federal employees discovered evidence of systematic constitutional violations and found that no internal remedy was available. Dr. Chen and her colleagues had met this demanding standard, she argued. They had discovered clear evidence of Fourth Amendment violations, had attempted for months to address the violations through internal channels, and had ultimately disclosed only the minimum information necessary to alert congressional oversight, committees, and the public to the constitutional crisis they had uncovered. Justice Elena Kagan followed with a series of technical questions about the relationship between Bondi's constitutional arguments and existing statutory protections for whistleblowers. She wanted to understand whether the relief being sought was necessary given the various federal laws that already provided some protection for employees who reported misconduct. Bondi's response revealed one of the most troubling aspects of the case. The existing statutory protections had proven to be completely inadequate when applied to national security agencies like the FBI. These statutes contained broad exceptions for classified information and national security matters that effectively exempted intelligence and law enforcement agencies from meaningful oversight. Moreover, the statutory protections relied on internal agency processes that were fundamentally compromised when the agency itself was engaged in constitutional violations. Dr. Chen and her colleagues had discovered that the very officials responsible for investigating misconduct allegations were themselves involved in authorizing and concealing the illegal surveillance program. The inadequacy of statutory protections in cases involving systematic constitutional violations, Bondi argued, demonstrated why constitutional safeguards were essential. The Constitution could not be effectively enforced through statutory mechanisms that could be manipulated or circumvented by the very agencies that were violating constitutional principles. Justice Neil Gorsuch, who had been following the argument with intense concentration, posed a question that revealed his own evolving understanding of the case's implications. He wanted to know whether the surveillance program that Bondi had described was still operational and whether similar programs might be continuing without public knowledge or congressional oversight. The question opened the door for Bondi to reveal another dimension of her investigation that had not been included. In the original legal briefs, while the specific surveillance program that Dr. Chen had exposed had been officially discontinued, her research had uncovered evidence suggesting that similar programs were operating within other federal agencies, protected by the same culture of secrecy and the same legal theories that had justified the FBI's constitutional violations. The revelation sent a visible shock through the courtroom. Several justices exchanged glances that suggested they were beginning to understand that the case before them was not an isolated incident, but potentially the tip of a much larger iceberg of constitutional violations. The implications were staggering, suggesting that the federal government might be systematically violating the constitutional rights of American citizens through secret programs that operated beyond any meaningful oversight or accountability. Justice Sonia Sotomayor asked a direct question about the scope of these other programs and the evidence that supported Bondi's allegations. Her tone suggested both deep concern and a recognition that the court might be confronting constitutional violations that went far beyond the specific case before them. Bondi responded with careful precision, explaining that her investigation had been limited by the classified nature of much of the relevant information and the understandable reluctance of current federal employees to risk their careers by cooperating with her research. But the evidence she had been able to gather suggested a pattern of constitutional violations that extended across multiple agencies and had been facilitated by a systematic interpretation of surveillance authorities that effectively nullified constitutional protections. The pattern, she continued, reflected a fundamental transformation in the relationship between the federal government and American citizens, a transformation that had occurred largely in secret and without any public debate about its constitutional implications. Intelligence and law enforcement agencies had developed the technical capability to monitor virtually all electronic communications, and they had interpreted existing legal authorities in ways that allowed them to exercise this capability with minimal oversight or accountability. Chief Justice Roberts attempted to interrupt with a question about the proper role of the courts in addressing these broader constitutional issues, but Bondi continued speaking with an intensity and conviction that commanded attention even from the Chief Justice himself. The courts, she argued, represented the last line of defense for constitutional government when the political branches failed to provide adequate oversight of executive power. If the judiciary abdicated its responsibility to enforce constitutional limits on government authority, then the Constitution would become a meaningless document, honored in rhetoric but ignored in practice. The case before the court, she continued, represented a critical test of whether constitutional government could survive in an era of expanding executive power and technological surveillance capabilities. The justices had an opportunity to reaffirm the fundamental principle that no government agency, regardless of its national security responsibilities, was above the constitutional law. As Bondi spoke, her voice carried a passion and conviction that transcended ordinary legal advocacy. She was not merely arguing for her clients, or even for the abstract principle of constitutional protection for whistleblowers. She was making a moral argument about the kind of country America could be and the role that constitutional law must play in preserving democratic governance. The justices listened with an attention and engagement that was rarely seen during Supreme Court arguments. Even those who were ideologically predisposed to support broad executive authority seemed genuinely troubled by the evidence of constitutional violations that Bondi had presented. The case had evolved from a technical legal dispute into a fundamental confrontation about the nature of constitutional government in America. Justice Amy Coney Barrett, who had remained largely silent throughout the argument, finally spoke with a question that revealed her own struggle to reconcile the competing values at stake in the case. She wanted to understand how the court could provide meaningful protection for whistleblowers without undermining the legitimate need for governmental secrecy in national security matters. Bondi's response demonstrated the sophisticated balance that she had developed between constitutional principles and practical governance needs. She argued that constitutional protections for whistleblowers would actually strengthen rather than weaken national security by ensuring that intelligence and law enforcement agencies operated within constitutional boundaries. Agencies that violated constitutional principles, she continued, ultimately undermined their own effectiveness by destroying public trust and creating internal cultures of secrecy and retaliation that discouraged the kind of honest assessment and internal criticism that was essential for effective operations. Constitutional accountability was not the enemy of effective government, but its prerequisite. The surveillance program that Dr. Chen had exposed, for example, had not only violated the constitutional rights of American citizens, but had also produced intelligence of questionable value, while consuming enormous resources that could have been devoted to legitimate law enforcement priorities. The program's constitutional violations had ultimately been exposed not by external oversight, but by dedicated federal employees who had risked their careers to uphold their constitutional oath. Justice Brett Kavanaugh asked a follow-up question about the specific constitutional standards that would govern future cases involving whistleblower protections. He wanted to understand how courts would distinguish between legitimate whistleblowing and mere disagreement with agency policies, particularly in cases involving classified information and national security matters. Bondi responded with a detailed discussion of the constitutional framework she was proposing, grounded in both First Amendment principles and the constitutional oath that all federal employees were required to take. The protection would apply only in cases where employees had credible evidence of constitutional violations, had attempted to address those violations through appropriate internal channels, and had limited their disclosures to the minimum information necessary to alert proper authorities to the constitutional crisis. The framework included significant procedural safeguards designed to prevent abuse, while ensuring that genuine constitutional violations could not be concealed through institutional retaliation. Courts would be required to conduct in-camera reviews of classified information to determine whether disclosures were justified, and employees would bear the burden of demonstrating that their actions met the demanding constitutional standard. As Bondi outlined this framework, it became clear that she had thought deeply about the practical implications of her constitutional theory and had developed sophisticated mechanisms for balancing competing values and interests. Her argument was not merely idealistic, but pragmatic, offering a realistic path forward that could protect constitutional principles while preserving legitimate governmental authority. The time allocated for oral argument was rapidly running out, but Chief Justice Roberts seemed reluctant to bring the proceeding to a close. The revelations that had emerged during Bondi's argument had fundamentally altered the court's understanding of the case, and several justices appeared to want additional time to explore the implications of what they had learned. Justice Thomas asked one final question about the long-term consequences of the court's decision in the case. He wanted to understand whether a ruling in favor of the whistleblowers would encourage other federal employees to come forward with evidence of constitutional violations in their own agencies. Bondi's response was both hopeful and sobering. A strong ruling in favor of constitutional protections for whistleblowers would indeed encourage federal employees to report constitutional violations, but it would also likely reveal the scope of misconduct that had been concealed by the current culture of secrecy and retaliation. The American people might discover that constitutional violations were far more widespread than they had imagined, but they would also have the opportunity to address those violations through democratic processes rather than allowing them to continue in secret. The choice before the court, she argued, was ultimately between comfortable ignorance and uncomfortable truth. Constitutional government required citizens to confront difficult realities about their government's conduct, even when those realities challenged comfortable assumptions about American democracy. Chief Justice Roberts finally indicated that the time for argument had expired, but rather than immediately calling for rebuttal from the Solicitor General, he paused for a long moment that seemed to stretch indefinitely. The entire courtroom remained silent, waiting for some indication of how the court would proceed. When the Chief Justice finally spoke, his voice carried a gravity that was unusual even for Supreme Court proceedings. He announced that the court would take a brief recess before hearing rebuttal argument, explaining that the justices needed time to consider the significant new information that had been presented during the proceeding. The announcement was unprecedented in the experience of most court observers. Supreme Court oral arguments typically proceeded according to a rigid schedule, with minimal interruption for anything other than technical difficulties. The decision to recess suggested that the justices were genuinely struggling to process the implications of what they had learned and needed time to confer among themselves before continuing. During the recess, the courtroom buzzed with quiet conversation as observers attempted to make sense of what they had witnessed. Legal reporters frantically revised their stories, while the attorneys for both sides huddled with their colleagues to discuss the unexpected turn that the proceeding had taken. Solicitor General Morrison found himself in an extremely difficult position. His carefully prepared rebuttal argument had been designed to address Bondi's legal theories and constitutional arguments, but it had not anticipated the detailed factual revelations about surveillance programs and constitutional violations. He would need to respond not merely to abstract legal claims, but to specific allegations of misconduct that went to the heart of executive branch operations. Dr. Chen and the other whistleblowers sat in the gallery with expressions that combined hope and apprehension. They had waited years for their story to be heard by the highest court in the land, and Bondi had exceeded their most optimistic expectations in presenting their case. But they also understood that the government's rebuttal could potentially undermine everything that had been accomplished during the morning's argument. When the court reconvened after the recess, the atmosphere in the courtroom had changed dramatically. The justices returned to the bench with expressions that suggested they had engaged in intense discussion during their break. Chief Justice Roberts announced that the court was prepared to hear rebuttal argument from the Solicitor General, but his tone suggested that the government would face significantly more skeptical questioning than had been anticipated. Morrison rose to present his rebuttal with considerably less confidence than he had displayed during his opening argument. The revelations during Bondi's presentation had fundamentally altered the landscape of the case, and he found himself in the uncomfortable position of defending not merely abstract legal principles, but specific governmental conduct that several justices clearly found troubling. His rebuttal began with an attempt to refocus the court's attention on what he characterized as the narrow legal issues that were properly before them. The case, he argued, involved the appropriate scope of constitutional protections for federal employees, not the underlying merits of the surveillance programs that had been discussed during petitioner's argument. Justice Ginsburg interrupted almost immediately with a sharp question about whether the government disputed the factual allegations that Bondi had presented regarding the surveillance program and the retaliation against whistleblowers. Her tone suggested skepticism about Morrison's attempt to compartmentalize the legal and factual dimensions of the case. Morrison's response was carefully crafted but ultimately unsatisfying. He could not dispute the basic facts about the surveillance program, which had been the subject of congressional investigations and public reporting following the whistleblowers' disclosures. But he argued that the existence of constitutional violations did not automatically establish that the whistleblowers were entitled to the broad constitutional protections that Bondi was advocating. Justice Sotomayor followed with a pointed question about the adequacy of existing legal remedies for federal employees who discovered constitutional violations within their agencies. She wanted to understand what alternatives were available to employees who found that internal reporting channels were compromised or ineffective. Morrison's answer revealed the fundamental weakness in the government's position. The existing statutory protections for whistleblowers contained broad exceptions for national security matters that effectively exempted intelligence and law enforcement agencies from meaningful oversight. Internal reporting mechanisms relied on the same officials who might be implicated in constitutional violations, creating obvious conflicts of interest that undermined their effectiveness. The Solicitor General argued that these limitations were necessary to protect legitimate national security interests, but his argument rang hollow in light of the evidence that had been presented about systematic constitutional violations. Several justices pressed him on whether national security concerns could justify the complete absence of meaningful accountability mechanisms for constitutional violations. Justice Gorsuch asked a particularly pointed question about the relationship between the constitutional oath that all federal employees were required to take and their obligations when they discovered evidence of constitutional violations by their own agencies. If employees were sworn to uphold the Constitution, he wondered, how could they fulfill that oath if they were prohibited from reporting constitutional violations through any available channel? Morrison struggled to provide a coherent answer to this question. The government's position essentially required federal employees to ignore constitutional violations when reporting them would conflict with agency policies or national security concerns. But this position seemed to nullify the constitutional oath entirely, reducing it to a meaningless formality rather than a substantive obligation. As Morrison's rebuttal continued, it became increasingly clear that the government's legal position had been seriously weakened by the factual revelations during Bondi's argument. The abstract legal principles that had seemed strong when applied to routine employment disputes appeared inadequate when confronted with evidence of systematic constitutional violations and institutional retaliation. Chief Justice Roberts attempted to help Morrison by asking whether the government would support legislative reforms that would provide stronger protections for national security whistleblowers while preserving necessary safeguards for classified information. But Morrison's response revealed the fundamental reluctance of executive agencies to accept any meaningful external oversight of their operations. The government's position, Morrison argued, was that existing legal frameworks were adequate and that additional protections for whistleblowers would interfere with legitimate executive branch authority. But this position seemed increasingly untenable in light of the evidence that existing frameworks had completely failed to prevent or address systematic constitutional violations. Justice Kagan pressed Morrison on whether the government believed that constitutional violations should ever be subject to external oversight when they occurred within national security agencies. Her question went to the heart of the separation of powers issues that the case presented, challenging the government's claim that executive agencies should be immune from judicial review of their constitutional compliance. Morrison's response was that national security agencies required special deference from the courts due to their expertise and the sensitivity of their operations. But several justices seemed skeptical of this argument, particularly given the evidence that agency, expertise had been used to justify rather than prevent constitutional violations. As Morrison's time began to run out, Chief Justice Roberts asked a final question that seemed designed to give the government one last opportunity to present a compelling justification for its position. He wanted to know whether the Solicitor General could identify any realistic mechanism for ensuring constitutional compliance within national security agencies if whistleblower protections were not strengthened. Morrison's answer revealed the fundamental hollowness of the government's position. He could not identify any meaningful accountability mechanism other than the internal processes that had already proven to be inadequate. His argument essentially boiled down to a request that the court trust executive agencies to police themselves, despite clear evidence that such self-policing had failed to prevent systematic constitutional violations. When Morrison concluded his rebuttal and returned to his seat, the atmosphere in the courtroom was charged with tension and anticipation. The oral argument had evolved far beyond what anyone had expected, revealing constitutional issues that went to the very heart of democratic governance in America. Chief Justice Roberts announced that the case was submitted for decision, but his tone suggested that the court's deliberations would be unusually complex and consequential. The justices filed out of the courtroom in their traditional order, but several paused to exchange quiet words with their colleagues, suggesting that the case had generated significant discussion and disagreement among them. In the months that followed, legal observers and constitutional scholars would debate the implications of what had transpired during the oral argument. The case had begun as a relatively narrow dispute about employment law, but had evolved into a fundamental examination of constitutional government and the rule of law in America. The decision, when it finally came, would reflect the profound impact that Bondi's argument had made on the court's understanding of the issues at stake. By a margin of 6-3, the justices ruled in favor of the whistleblowers, establishing, for the first time, a constitutional framework for protecting federal employees who exposed constitutional violations within their own agencies. The majority opinion, written by Chief Justice Roberts himself, acknowledged that the case had forced the court to confront uncomfortable truths about constitutional violations within the executive branch. But it also affirmed that constitutional government required transparency, accountability, and respect for the rule of law, even when those principles conflicted with institutional convenience or political expedience. The decision would have far-reaching implications beyond the specific case before the court. In the years that followed, dozens of federal employees would come forward with evidence of constitutional violations within their agencies, protected by the legal framework that had been established through Dr. Chen's courage and Bondi's advocacy. But perhaps the most significant legacy of the case was the transformation it had wrought in Chief Justice Roberts himself. The confident smile that had marked his initial challenge to Bondi's arguments had been replaced by a deeper understanding of the complex relationship between constitutional principles and governmental power. In private conversations with his colleagues, Roberts would later acknowledge that the case had forced him to reconsider fundamental assumptions about executive authority and judicial oversight. The moment when his dismissive laughter had been met with devastating factual revelations had taught him a profound lesson about the dangers of prejudging cases based on conventional legal wisdom. The case had demonstrated that constitutional government required not merely formal legal protections, but a culture of accountability that encouraged rather than punished those who sought to uphold constitutional principles. It had shown that the rule of law could not survive in a system where those who exposed constitutional violations faced retaliation, while those who committed such violations escaped accountability. Years later, when legal historians wrote about the transformation of constitutional law in the early 21st century, they would identify the case as a crucial turning point. It had established that constitutional principles were not mere abstractions, but living commitments that required active protection and enforcement, even when such enforcement challenged powerful institutions and entrenched interests. Dr. Chen, whose courage in exposing constitutional violations had made the entire case possible, would go on to establish a foundation dedicated to supporting federal whistleblowers and promoting transparency in government operations. Her work would help dozens of other federal employees find the courage to speak out about constitutional violations, knowing that they would have legal protection and public support. Bondi's performance before the Supreme Court would be remembered as one of the most effective pieces of advocacy in the court's modern history. She had demonstrated that careful preparation, moral conviction, and strategic thinking could overcome even the most daunting institutional advantages. But perhaps most importantly, the case had reaffirmed the fundamental principle that in a constitutional democracy, no institution, no matter how powerful or prestigious, could place itself above the rule of law. The Constitution's protections were not negotiable, and those who sought to uphold them deserved protection rather than punishment. The laughter that had echoed through the Supreme Court chamber on that October morning had been silenced not by anger or indignation, but by truth. And in that silence, a new understanding of constitutional government had been born, one that would shape American law and democracy for generations to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.